All right, well, hello and welcome to everybody. I am so excited to be here with all of you this afternoon. It is truly a privilege to be in a room filled with amazing scientists, physicians, and to take some time and space over the next couple hours to pour back into ourselves. So by way of getting us started, before we really kick off the talks, I want to share a story. And I want to share a story about my mother. My mother was a physician. She's almost 80 now. She's retired, but she graduated medical school in 1969. She was one of 10 women in her medical school class of 300, and she was also the youngest graduate of Northwestern Medical School ever at the time, at the age of 23. She was kind of a rock star. But I didn't know that as a kid. I didn't realize it was special to have a mom that was a doctor, and I didn't know it was different to have parents who really encouraged their female child in a STEM career. I mean, doesn't everybody get a Grey's Anatomy coloring book when they're 8 years old? No, just me? It wasn't really until I got into high school and I saw that fewer and fewer of my peers in my science classes, and especially my advanced science classes, were women. And that's when I got a little curious about my mom's experience. And I remember asking her what it was like. She had some very interesting stories, my favorite of which was the medical school evaluation that read simply, "Jeannie always comes to rounds with her hair nicely combed." My father was in her medical school class, and he never got any comments about his hair in his evaluations. I would love to stand up here and tell you that things have radically shifted since that time, and unfortunately, I can't. Women are less likely to receive funding for grants. Women are more likely to be denied authorship on papers to which they contributed, and women are simply less likely to be called doctor. Just last month, I was talking with a client who is a psychiatrist, and she told me about someone who came into their organization to sell something, and he repeatedly referred to all of the male psychiatrists as Dr. So-and-so and all of the female psychiatrists by their first name. Sometimes when I share about the lack of progress we've made in the last 60 years, it can make us feel like giving up, but that is not what we are here to do today. Today, we are here to create sustainable changes to facilitate growth in our career. We are here to validate the challenging road that you are on, and we are here to create community and hope. Today, we're going to start out hearing from Dr. Jagsi. She is a remarkable physician and scientist, and she will help you understand that if you think this is harder for you as a woman, you're right. Her research on the state of women in medicine is life-changing. Then we'll move into the workshop portion where we will hear about some different tools and techniques and ways to learn, exercises, and ways to connect here in this room today. And it is my hope that you will leave this room feeling aligned and empowered to take brave next steps in your own careers. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jagsi. Reshma Jagsi is the Lawrence Davis Professor and Chair of the Department of Radiation Oncology, and she is a Senior Faculty Fellow in the Center for Ethics at Emory University. She is the author of over 450 publications and is the PI of multiple NIH grants, including 2 active R01s and a U54. Both a clinical trialist and health services researcher, she is internationally recognized for research to strengthen autonomy in breast cancer patients and to individualize breast cancer care. Inspired by her patients, she is active in the NCI cooperative groups for clinical trials and leads multi-center randomized trials of foregoing radiotherapy in lower-risk patients, intensifying it in patients with more aggressive disease, and enhancing patient-centered communication. She also investigates women's underrepresentation in senior positions in academic medicine and the mechanisms that must be targeted to promote equity. Active in organized medicine, she serves on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the NIH Advisory Committee for Research on Women's Health, the Steering Committee of the Early Breast Cancer Trialist Collaborative Group, and the Lancet's Breast Cancer Commission. She is the recipient of multiple honors and awards for her science, her leadership, and her mentorship, and her contributions have been recognized with her election to the National Academy of Medicine, the American Society of Clinical Investigation, and the Association of American Physicians. We are delighted to have her here to share her research with us today. Welcome, Dr. Jagsi.
Sorry, I was tweeting that Anne is amazing and people should come. So it is my pleasure to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour or so giving you an overview of some evidence-based strategies that we can all employ to address the systemic barriers that face women researchers. These are my disclosures, if I can get the thing to work. Okay, so those are my disclosures. And so I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about the evidence that my team and others have collected about the nature and the causes of inequity in the professions of medicine and science, and particularly the research relating to breast cancer. And I'll reflect on the data that have been collected that suggests that this is not simply due to a slow pipeline, but actually reflects the differential impact of challenges such as unconscious biases, gendered expectations of society, and overt discrimination and harassment. And then we'll use that evidence base in the same way that we do to address breast cancer. We're going to come up with evidence-based interventions to target the root causes and the causal mechanisms. So these are really recent data showing the distribution of medical school graduates. And you can see that early on, women were a very, very small proportion of medical school graduates. It wasn't until 1972 with the advent of Title IX, which was actually the first policy that prevented there being discrimination in hiring and promotions at medical schools. So the Civil Rights Act, 1965, did prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex as well as on the basis of race. But it did not apply to institutions of higher education. So it wasn't until 1972 that Title IX, which I think many of us think of as having to do with equitable access to sporting opportunities, actually transformed the face of modern medicine. And what you can see here is that although women are now outnumbering men among medical students, women are still underrepresented amongst the senior-most leaders of those fields, the department chairs and the deans and the system leaders of these healthcare systems, so really hovering around that 1/4 rather than the half of the population or the more than half of medical students that we are now. And so this extends to other positions of influence and authority. We all know that in academic medicine, one of the key ways that we communicate with one another and also set the agenda for future research is through academic publication. And so it's really important to know whether diverse perspectives are being represented. And this was really the first study that I did in this space. I was a resident in training at Mass General over 20 years ago, and my mentor was the head of the Office for Women's Careers. And she recruited me in the wonderful way that good mentors and sponsors will, to be on that committee. And one day at the end of a committee meeting, and I was very, I really did think, and this is interesting because neither the women of the younger generation nor the women of my mother's generation will have any sympathy for me, but the women of my generation, if there's any Generation Xers out there, you will understand why I thought that my mother's generation had solved this. I thought that with that wave of feminism, that these issues had been solved. Thank you. There's like a couple of Gen Xers who are nodding to me, right? We grew up with an expectation of an equitable division of domestic labor. Our moms worked, or if our moms didn't work, then we had good friends whose moms worked, and we never thought that there were going to be issues with us being offered opportunities related to our gender. So I didn't think this was going to be a thing. I thought this was just going to work itself out, right? It was going to take some time. I mean, 1972 at that time wasn't all that long ago. So if we just waited a little longer, then the classes of medical school where women were constituting higher proportions would eventually fill the pipeline and things would just work themselves out. But I did say at the end of one of these meetings, I do find it kind of depressing that when I look at the cover of the New England Journal of Medicine, which back then, it wasn't just first initial, last name, it was actually full name. And it's like, it is kind of daunting to embark on a career where every week you get this journal that shows the people who've been most successful, and none of them have the name Nancy or Helen or Mary, right? I wasn't looking for Reshma. I was just like looking for a female name of the generation that I would expect to have been publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine, but it was always Lawrence or Henry or John, right, on the cover. And so we decided to look, and this is now kind of laughable for the quality of work that, I mean, I actually pulled journal after journal off of Countway Library's shelves to manually count and put this into a REDCap database. It wasn't even REDCap. It was some REDCap-esque database. That's how long ago it was. Now we've done many more sophisticated bibliometric studies, and the sad truth is that they've replicated time and time again, even to the present day, that women are represented in the most influential positions of authorship and editorial writing and editorial board membership. And why does that matter? Because, of course, we know when you get to write an editorial about a study, it allows you to shape the direction the field goes next. If you're on an editorial board, you can actually choose to create a theme issue of the journal and focus research on a particular area. Probably my favorite theme issue I've ever been part of was the Lancet's theme issue on women in biomedical research, science, medicine, global health. That theme issue, we thought when we put it together, was going to pull in, I mean, we had a relatively short deadline on it, maybe a couple of dozen papers, we hoped. We were going to publish 2 original research articles and a few brief reports and some editorials. It pulled in over 300 submissions. And so you can go back and look at that issue, which was back in 2018, but you can also look at the volume of papers written about women in these careers, because the ones that didn't get into the Lancet got submitted to other high-impact journals and got published elsewhere. And so that's how editorial boards and editors can shape the very direction that science takes, and why it's so important that people with all perspectives are represented. So when this paper got published, there was an interview done by a reporter, not with me, or I think they did interview me, but the smart thing they did was they interviewed the editor at the New England Journal who accepted the paper and said, doesn't this kind of make you guys look bad? Why did you choose to publish this? And the editor's response was really good, which was like, no, we don't think this makes us look bad. We don't think it has anything to do with our processes. We think that something is happening well before women get to the point of having a paper that merits consideration in the New England Journal of Medicine, because we're not seeing submissions from women either. We're just, and they actually also said one thing we could do better is maybe we could even out our invited editorialist pool. And we do see over time that has improved. But I will push back a little bit on the idea that this is entirely out of the control of the journals. So turns out that journals in academic medicine are a little unique, right? We actually engage in typically single-blinded peer review. So the authors don't know who the reviewers are, but the reviewers usually know who the authors are. There are some double open and some double-blinded journals. In fact, the International Journal of Radiation Oncology, Biology, and Physics, on which I was senior editor for breast cancer for many years, moved to a system of double-blinded peer review and addressed many of the criticisms of double-blinded peer review, which include, well, in a small field, you'll already have gone to the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium and seen the preliminary work in abstract or poster form or on a plenary stage, and so you're going to know who the authors are anyway. So what's the point in taking all the trouble to blind it? And it's so burdensome on authors to have to, not be able to refer their prior work and have to explain things over again, and it's never going to work. Well, we did it at the Red Journal, and we actually, for a 3-month period of time, required everyone submitting to the Red Journal and everyone reviewing for the Red Journal to fill out a very brief survey about their experiences. And it wasn't coercive, because you could submit 3 months later and we weren't going to lose your opportunity to publish in the Red Journal if you didn't want to fill out a survey. But we really wanted to know what everybody thought about this. And it turned out there was overwhelming support. Authors told us it wasn't that burdensome. They felt more fairly treated. Reviewers actually frequently told us they thought they knew who the authors were. And then we asked them, who are they? And they were wrong. So they didn't know. And overwhelmingly, everyone was in favor of this. And this is really important because we've learned a lot over the years. It turns out that symphony orchestras used to be all male, right? And it was thought that symphony orchestras were all male because there was some physiological difference where men had more lung capacity to blow into wind instruments, or had a broader finger span to play Rachmaninoff. Look at my finger span, it's not bad. It turns out that the intervention it took was a very simple one, and it was a screen between the auditioner and the evaluator, as well as a carpet to mask the sound of the heels. And that's what it took to realize that women sound like they can play music. They just don't look like they can play music. So maybe we can wait these things out. As I mentioned, there is a point in our history with Title IX in 1972 where we saw the increased entry of women into the field. At this point, it feels like a long time since 1972, but I keep the slide in because every time I take it out, the next time I have to put it back in because somebody says, well, I really think you didn't address the pipeline hypothesis. So the best way to address the pipeline hypothesis, and this is really a metaphor that's fallen out of favor. Janine Clayton, who's the head of the Office for Research on Women's Health at the NIH, has actually introduced this concept of a braided river, which I think is a much more effective metaphor. But the idea of the pipeline hypothesis is that if we just wait long enough, that there is a slow but otherwise functional pipeline. And Lynn Nonemaker did the best study that you could do to look at this. And instead of looking at static cross-sections over time, like the earlier studies that I showed you, she looked at 15 cohorts of medical school graduates, and she looked at what happened in their careers. And she found that in all but 2 of the 15 cohorts she looked at, the women were less likely to advance to the rank of associate professor. And even the ones who got to associate professor, nominally the rank of senior faculty, were less likely to become full professor than their male counterparts. And it was not a small difference. The difference between observed and expected was 5-fold off. Okay, big difference. Now, the graduates she looked at were from 1979 to 1993, and you heard me say, 1972 was when Title IX occurred, so maybe we just needed to look at more recent cohorts. So we can thank Kimber Richter and colleagues for actually looking at more recent cohorts of medical school graduates all the way through 2013, and unfortunately what they found was that the gender gap didn't narrow at all in those more recent cohorts. So what might be going on here? So, when I published that New England Journal paper, I was finishing my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the president of Harvard University at that time made some pretty infamous comments about the reason you might see women underrepresented in certain disciplines. And I wanted to think of a way to address this question that even Larry Summers himself couldn't fight with. So where could I find a pool of equally apt, equally motivated men and women who were mature in their careers, wanted to pursue research? Well, there's the K Award program, as I think to myself as I'm becoming a faculty member. There's this thing called the K Award program, and it's a nationally competitive program. There are institutional Ks, but we chose to look at K08s and K23s deliberately because it's an incredibly competitive, elite, selective a program for promising investigators. And these promising investigators are given protected time and support from our federal government with an articulated goal of transforming them into independent investigators. And there was a public database. So again, now I didn't have to pull journals off the shelf. There was a database that I could pull data from. NIH had, the reporter system was called CRISP back then. And we gathered data from that database to look at whether individuals with K08 or K23 awards, and K08s and 23s we picked because they were clinician investigators. Many of the things I'm talking about are not specific to clinicians, but I do want to emphasize that these are people who have either an MD or another form of clinical doctorate. So it's 80 to 90%, depending on the year, MDs, and then there are some doctors of nursing practice, veterinarians, dentists, doctors of psychology, and so on mixed in. So we looked at whether these individuals went on to get R01 grants. Not because R01 grants from the NIH are the be-all and end-all, but this is like a hallmark for the transition to independence, and it is frequently viewed as a sign that you've made it. And it was something that we could measure. Right? So there's the data in the CRISP system. The one trick was we couldn't entirely be sure that a woman didn't get a K award in one name and then change her name due to marriage or divorce and get the R in a different name. Turns out, if you ever want to do a study like this again, Amy Motomura, who is now a law professor, was a research associate for me. I hope I didn't scare her out of biomedical research altogether, but she spent her time with me meticulously making sure that Mary Smith did not become Mary Jones. So for every person, we looked at their first name and whether there were any subsequent R01 grants. And of course, it's much easier now and there's more unique identifiers, but there had never been an analysis actually following human beings over their life course. Even though we were investing so much money in these K awardees, we never looked at whether they actually converted to R01s before this. And, all of the analyses of gender equity looked very appropriately at the process of selection. At the time of a grant being submitted, was a grant submitted by a woman less likely to be funded than a grant submitted by a man, which of course is very important, and they weren't finding differences in that, but it wasn't accounting for whether a woman was less likely to come back with a reapplication or less likely to submit in the first place, which would also suggest that there was some problem in the pipeline or braided river. And this is what we found. And so, like all of you, I am a breast cancer researcher, so I think of things in actuarial survival curves. And somebody said to me very early on when they saw these results, like, this is great, you had a really good surrogate endpoint for survival in academic medicine. Because failure to achieve an R01 within 5 years of your K does not bode well for your survival in academic medicine. And so what you see here is that the rate of R01 attainment was both for the male and the female recipients, and this was extrinsically attributed by us based on first name and searching for photographs, and I fully recognize, and we'll come back to the limitations of binary gender and the limitations of this early work. But what we found was that regardless of gender, the rates of R01 attainment were lower than we expected, and that gender was an independently significant predictor of R01 attainment on the multivariable analysis that controlled for everything we could in that publicly available data set. So we controlled for K08 versus K23 because K08s are basic science-oriented and K23s were patient-oriented research at the time. We controlled for the year of the award because women were a minority of K awardees. There was no affirmative action in the K award program. Women were a minority of K awardees early on, but they started becoming a gradually growing proportion of the K awardees over time, and the funding environment got more difficult over time. So perhaps that was driving the difference. We controlled for that. We controlled for the funding institute, because it turns out that although I imagine everyone in this room applies to NCI, women are much less likely to apply to NCI, NHLBI, the more well-funded institutes of funding, and more likely to apply to the less well-funded institutes, so that might matter. We have institution. Women are less likely to be at the institutions that overall have higher levels of extramural research funding, and we control for specialty. And what we found was that difference, which, if I showed that in a clinical session, you'd all want to buy some stock in whatever company made that drug, right? So we then went on to survey the K awardees. And we looked at 800 of the K awardees who got their new awards between 2000 and 2003. And we asked them about various personal characteristics, productivity characteristics. We were actually more interested in broadening the definition of success. This was not the primary goal of this study. This study was actually trying to look at whether, if we looked at whether maybe women were more likely to be funded by a fairy godmother foundation that plucks out promising people, then they didn't bother applying for an R01 grant because they had support from a foundation. Or, were women more likely to be publishing papers, although my prior work notwithstanding, maybe they were more likely to be seeing science all the way through to its end point rather than writing the new grant, but they were still having their voice represented. Maybe they were in leadership positions. Many of my studies are just responses to reviewer number 2. So response to reviewer number 2, is it possible that those promising K awardees were so outstanding that instead of having a chance to go get an R01 themselves, they immediately got appointed to be division chief or department chair, and then they were responsible for the careers of many other people, and so you're just not picking them up because of that? Like, well, women are a very small minority of those division chiefs and department chairs, but okay, we can address reviewer number 2 in our next study. So that was the goal of this study. Turns out that even when you broaden the definition of success with all of those measures, women are still less likely to achieve those forms of academic success than men. But we also asked about compensation. And this is really important because prior studies had shown that physicians had differential compensation by gender, but many of those studies lacked information about even some really basic information like specialty. And so we didn't just get specialty, we got a whole bunch of other stuff, so we thought, let's take a look. And what we found was that when we controlled for specialty alone, and this was my hypothesis, that the specialty would explain the vast majority of the difference. Well, it cut the difference in half. So the men were making about $200,000 a year, the women were making $168,000, and the difference was cut in half when you put into the multivariable model factors related to specialty. When you added everything else that's listed there, right, this whole litany of things that people bring up as things that justify the difference in compensation, when you threw that whole thing in the model, you still had a $12,000 a year unexplained difference, okay? And so there's other ways of looking at this that labor economists do. We did something called a Peters-Belson analysis, or Waksaka is the other way of looking at it, where you model the salary in the disadvantaged group. You model the salary in the advantage group, so the advantage group here is men. So you create a multivariable model in the men, and then you apply that model to the women, and you predict what salaries they should have gotten if you use the model for men, and then you look at the difference there. And no matter what kind of analysis you do, there is an unexplained gap. So what is going on here? So I mentioned that specialty choice was the hypothesis, and it's really important. I would say look around this room, but part of that is the draw of the subject matter. But look around the room more broadly. Women do gravitate to certain areas within medicine. And part of that is because they're encouraged to do so, and part of that is because when women gravitate to those areas, then they actually pay less because of what's known as occupational gender segregation. So what do I mean here? So for example, any pediatric specialty that you look at pays less than the corresponding adult specialty. It's actually harder to intubate a smaller orifice. It's basically harder to do the things that pediatricians do. And the best example is pediatric neurology, where they actually do neurology for 4 years. And then if you want to be a pediatric neurologist, you do an additional fellowship training. And any economist will tell you it's irrational to do the pediatric neurology training because you emerge from pediatric neurology training with a lower starting salary than if you entered the job market after just finishing general neurology training. So you lower your salary by getting additional training. And so guess who all the pediatric neurologists are? Almost all women, right? And so what's going on there? We have this phenomenon of occupational gender segregation. We value women's health less. We value children's health less. We encourage women to take care of other women and children. And you know, it's very interesting. I mean, like if you look at radiology, breast radiology, lower RVUs. Look at radiation oncology, breast radiation oncology, lower RVUs. Every subspecialty, when we start looking at the subfields that get dominated by women, there ends up being some impact of this. There are also differences in productivity. And sorry, let me just say one more thing about specialty choice. This relates to certain expectations we have about feminine and masculine behaviors, okay? Society inculcates in kids from a very young age for little girls to exhibit communal, caretaking behaviors, and for little boys to exhibit agentic, go out there and accomplish something kinds of behaviors. And so the challenge there is that our RVU productivity system focuses very much on the agentic, procedural, get something done kind of behaviors. And the time-consuming evaluation and management procedures that are often the things that really promote health are reimbursed less well. So I think it's very ironic that I, as a radiation oncologist, am paid so much more for conformally treating a lung tumor that develops in a patient, whether or not I cure the patient of the lung tumor, and the primary care physician who has spent visit upon visit counseling a patient to begin smoking cessation, to adhere to that decision, and saves their life not only from lung cancer, but from heart disease and all the other horrible things that smoking does to you, gets paid less for that lifetime of visits probably than I do for that one acute episode of care delivery. There's differences in productivity, hours, and willingness to change institutions. So you've probably realized that when I put things in quotation marks, I think there's more to the story. So willingness to change institutions in particular is a choice that's not a totally freely willed, unconstrained choice. We live within a gender-structured society in which women are expected to partner with men, and please hear me, I did not say I expect women to partner with men, but our society still, by and large, expects women to partner with men, and it expects those men to be at or above the women's age and at or above the women's educational status. So what does that mean? That means that even in a two-career, two-physician couple, the women's career often comes second. She becomes the trailing spouse. She's a little bit younger. And we see this play out in our K awardee surveys. We've asked whose career comes first. And our female K awardees are much more likely to tell us my spouse or partner's career comes first. And there's choices of, they're equal and mine comes first. But on the scaled spectrum, the women are more towards my spouse or partner's career comes first than the men are. And so when we negotiate up salaries based on a credible threat to leave, we disadvantage those in the population who have become a trailing spouse to a full-time working partner. And in our K awardee surveys, what we found is that over 90% of the women have a full-time employed partner. Over half the men in those same samples have part-time or non-working spouses. So it's a big difference. There's also differences in rank and leadership positions, and so we control for these in the model, right? But it can be a double whammy to control for these, because if we say, well, we pay Jane less than John because John's the division chief and Jane isn't, then we're assuming that the process to pick the division chief was not Bob, the department chair, went golfing with John over the weekend and thought, I need a new division chief, and John told me all about the great stuff he's doing. I'm totally going to tap him on the shoulder instead of doing the best practices that we all know should be in place for transparently posting a position, having an unbiased search process, and so forth. And what's really remarkable here is we controlled for all of those things. And we still found that $12,000 a year. Now, we found $12,000 a year, and we said, even if you just crudely use an inflation adjustment over the course of a career, because we know that if it's $12,000 difference early in your career, it's just going to be a bigger difference later in your career, that the gap is just going to widen, and this is going to accumulate, and it's a lot of money. It's going to be many hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you invest it, it's going to be even more than that. And there have been some recent computer simulation studies that have actually suggested that it is millions, plural, for physicians in practice today, that what that gender gap adds up to. So what else could be going on here? Perhaps there are gender differences in values or behavior that might explain that residual difference, right? So we know that there are certain gender role concordant behaviors. Maybe mothers are sacrificing pay for unobserved job characteristics like flexibility to support their families, and fathers are trying to earn more to support their families. That would be gender role concordant. There was an economist, Anthony Losasso, who said that's got to be the explanation. He gave a quote to I think it was the Wall Street Journal. That's got to be the explanation for this study. To his credit, in like 2020 or 2021, he published a follow-up where he had access to data to starting salaries in New York State, and he asked people about their preferences for family flexibility. And it turned out he replicated our study entirely, and the preferences for family flexibility did not explain the difference, but specialty explained half of it. We also, in our study, found no interaction between gender and parental status. There's another behavioral difference, though. So how many of you read the book Women Don't Ask, or its sequel, Ask for It? 1, 2, 3. I think that's including our coach. I got 3. Okay, so this is important. So Women Don't Ask is a landmark book by Babcock and Lashover that goes over the social scientific studies, the abundant evidence collected over decades that shows that women are less likely to negotiate in a particular way. And it also shows that their failure to do so is probably adaptive, because there are penalties for negotiating in the same way as men for women. They go on to a sequel called Ask for It, and I really like Ask for It, so if you're going to buy one of the books, I'd buy the sequel, because it actually has strategies that anyone of any gender can utilize. And one of the ideas is that they're building on getting to yes, which is the Bible of negotiation. It is the idea that we should engage in principled negotiation, put ourselves in the other party's shoes, look for mutual interest and shared gains, And by doing that, we elevate the size of the pie, we elevate the quality of the discussion, we actually make both parties better off. And it's something we don't learn in grad school or med school. They all learn it in business school and law school. So it's a good, I have no stock in it. It's a good book to consider picking up. There's also differences in employer behavior. We know that there is a phenomenon known as statistical discrimination, and labor economists will talk about when employers are making inferences based on group characteristics like mean productivity rather than considering individual characteristics when they're setting salaries. And there's also this notorious notion of a family wage, where we pay someone enough to support the family at home. And if the person doesn't have a family at home that they're supporting, then they don't need the salary as much. And really what we should be rewarding is the performance in the workplace. So Amy Gottlieb and I wrote about how all of the different components of salary setting and incentive payment conspire to create really a crucible within which all of the forces of gender bias and inequity come together. And so we must work together. And really, most of this talk, at least my part, is not about asking you to fix yourselves. It's about empowering you to fix the system so that this is not how it is for our daughter's generation. Because I did think my mom's generation fixed it, but they didn't. And my generation didn't either. So it's up to those of us in the room to fix it now. The one probably most powerful factor here is unconscious bias. So the National Academy of Sciences wrote a beautiful report about these deeply ingrained notions that we all hold regardless of gender. And it goes over the impressive body of controlled experimental studies and examination of decision-making processes in real life that show that on the average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. They're less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments. And when information's scarce, far more often give the benefit of the doubt to a man than a woman. And so the classic study here was an academic psychology study. Steinprice and colleagues sent out CVs with Karen Miller at the top or Brian Miller at the top. Same CV body. Half the people got Karen Miller, randomized trial. Half the people got Brian Miller. Nobody was told we're sending the other people a different name on the CV. No, it was, hey, we're academic psychologists, we're sending you a sham CV. Would this person be hired at your institution? And can you just give us some ratings of their merit? Like their scholarship, their service, their teaching. And it turns out that not only is Karen Miller less likely to be hired than Brian Miller, on the basis of the same exact CV, the only difference is the first name, Karen Miller gets less good objective merit ratings. So when people say to me, Reshma, why do you care so much about equity? Why don't you just focus on excellence? Because our brains aren't wired always to recognize excellence, and so we have to work hard. And this has been shown in the setting of hiring of postdoctoral laboratory managers, in the setting of academic medicine, and in, I think, the most depressing study you will ever see, and I know that you are cancer researchers. Yes, Emily and Greg are more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal. Emily and Greg need 9 fewer years of experience on their resumes to get job interviews at the same rate. So that takes me to the most important slide of this talk. I've been talking up until now like gender is the only thing. I've been talking about it like it's binary. These are not true things. We have to recognize the importance of intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw in the legal literature raised this idea that individual human beings inhabit the intersection of multiple identities, and especially if more than one of those identities is marginalized, that intersection is a unique place to live that cannot be understood simply as the summation of the indignities of inhabiting one identity summed with the indignities of inhabiting the other. So being a Black woman in America is not simply the indignities of racism plus the indignities of sexism. There is a form of racialized sexism that exists that can only be understood by looking at that unique intersection. And so we must reflect on people as a total human being, all of their identities, and really strive particularly to understand what's going on at those intersections. in those National Academies reports I just quoted to you from Beyond Bias and Barriers, in the ones that have followed, including one on sexual harassment of women that was published in 2018, one on promising practices, which is great, but was published in 2020 in February, right before the pandemic took all of the news attention away from this landmark report, one on the impact of COVID-19, and most recently, just this past year, one on policies and practices for supporting family caregivers. In the more recent reports, there has really been concerted attention to taking an intersectional lens and applying it to these challenges. And so in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to just touch upon some of the key insights. So from that most recent study I mentioned, we're not playing on a level playing field here. Seemingly gender-neutral norms, practices, and policies can and do have a disparate negative impact upon women. These include policies that relate to leave from training. The American Academy of Pediatrics has supported policies to have 12 weeks of paid parental leave for all parents because they argue there's abundant evidence that it is better for children, it is better for parents, it is better for society. And yet, for many years, pediatricians and the rest of us in medicine have been making like a little carve-out. And the little carve-out is just our future colleagues. They don't need 12 weeks. Our future colleagues can just get away with like 2 days if they're men and maybe a couple weeks if they're women, right? And why do we do that? We have this ideal worker norm that is so strong in medicine that it actually robs us of the talent pool that we have available to the field. There are expectations regarding work hours. So how many of you have meetings at 6:30 or 7 in the morning sometimes because, we really want to include the surgeons? Or start at 7. We don't want to exclude anyone. Or how about clinical counsel at 6 o'clock? We don't want to exclude anyone. And yet we do systematically exclude people. I will tell you that my institution, we actually do have clinical counsel at 6 o'clock, and I will tell you the people whose cameras are off and who are doing childcare pickup are often the women who are trying their best to participate. But in this admirable pursuit of being inclusive in academic medicine, we have really strange expectations of the timing of the workday, and it really does collide with some of the family responsibilities. And so tenure clocks, limits on grant eligibility, same thing. If we say you can only be within 7 years of completing your training, individuals who've taken time out of the workplace to do other things like family care, and in our society, that is much more often women and people of color. And so women, I think most people realize, people of color, I'm not sure people realize, but if you think about formal caregiving and the lack of trustworthiness of many of the institutions of formal caregiving, then you might start to realize why many communities of color have been more reliant on informal caregiving, not to mention the fact that we in this country do not have good access to resources to support formal caregiving access. So this is my favorite study that we ever did out of that K awardee data set. And we asked the K awardees, how were they spending their time? So this was actually my first R01 grant, and it's like the most meta R01 ever, because I was just about the age that I should have been applying for a K, but there came to be a call for proposals for Rs in this area, and so I thought, maybe I'll try it. And so I got an R to study the R attainment of other people roughly my age. Really interesting cohort, right? So I've been following them for years. And so we asked them how they were spending their time. And what we found was, won't be a surprise to anyone in this room, the women weren't lazier than the men. The women were actually having more hours of total labor. This is how labor economists think about labor. There's paid labor, there's unpaid labor. But when you look at the paid labor, there's a bar that's shorter. You see that 35 and 40? Do you know what that is? That's research time. Because when you think about the day, what's the most flexible part of your day? It's not like they were working part-time, but there was something that was getting compressed. Because that big bar at the end, that's family and domestic labor. That's caregiving. And when we did a multivariable analysis and we adjusted for many factors, including spousal employment status, because you guys heard me say before, the spousal employment status is very different, with 90% of the women having full-time employed partners and over half of the men having non-working or part-time partners. We put that into the model. And the women were spending 8.5 more hours per week on parenting and domestic activities. And then we asked my single favorite question ever asked in a survey, and it was, what do you do when your usual childcare arrangements fall through? And at the time, we were thinking there's a snow day, or your kid's too sick to go to daycare, or the nanny's too sick to come in, or something like that. This was well before COVID-19. And yet we saw the outcome play out so dramatically during COVID-19, right? Because what we found was that 42.6% of the women, these are K awardees, these are clinician researchers, 42.6% of the women said, I usually take care of it myself. The choices were, I usually take care of it myself, my spouse or partner usually takes care of it, we have somebody else we turn to, we share it equally. 42.6%, I usually take care of it myself, right? And we saw that happen during the COVID pandemic. And it has real consequences. So because it was an R01, I got to survey them more than once. So we got to do a longitudinal design. So we were able to look at what factors early in their K award predicted for burnout later in their K awards. So one thing we found is what every study of burnout shows, which is that women were more likely to be burned out than men. We used a binary cutoff. If we used a linear scale, it was the same thing. Women had higher burnout scores than men. The point is, prior studies hadn't really explained why that difference was there. We were able to explain it. So it turned out it was those differences in time pressures that I just showed you. And then it's not going to surprise anyone in this room. It was differences in perceptions of work climate, right? Really helping us to now narrow in on what the interventions need to be. So why might there be differences in the perception of work climate? Well, this is the now quite famous metaphor of the iceberg of sexual harassment, which was developed by a psychology and women's studies professor, Lilia Cortina, at the University of Michigan. And she does this very deliberately to emphasize, first of all, frequency, because the tip of the iceberg is much smaller than the base of the iceberg. The frequency of those behaviors that are listed under the surface are much more common. And she does this because when we use the word sexual harassment, many people do not think of the construct that has been developed by scholars of psychology and women's studies, which includes gender harassing behaviors that are the ones beneath the surface. And they immediately go to the relatively uncommon episodes of overt sexual assault, quid pro quo, sleep with me and you won't get fired kinds of harassment. And yet, thankfully, those things are uncommon. They're not uncommon enough, but they are uncommon. But there's also a vast ignored base of the iceberg upon which those tip of the iceberg behaviors build. And what we know from the women's studies and organizational psychology literature is that those behaviors, if they're frequent or pervasive or severe, those behaviors beneath the iceberg, beneath the surface, can also have the same detrimental impact on the outcomes we care about. Physical well-being, mental well-being, professional well-being, tardiness, absenteeism, attrition from the workplace. We asked our K awardees, and we asked them whether they had encountered unwanted sexual comments, attention, or advances by a superior colleague. If you look at the date on this paper, it was published in May of 2016, so it was just before the 2016 presidential election. It was around the time of the awakening of the Me Too movement. And this was pretty shocking stuff. This was actually a question that had been asked last in 1995. And in 1995, 52% of the women endorsed this. Glass half full, it was only 30% when we asked it. This was really not what we expected to find. And again, this was before really the full awareness of the Me Too movement. And these experiences were not without consequence. 60% perceived a negative effect on themselves as professionals. Nearly half reported that these experiences negatively affected their career advancement. And these problematic experiences were ones that would have been even more frequent had we asked more than one question. So this is the crudest way you can ask about sexual harassment. What you're actually supposed to do is present a 20-item SEQ, which we did do in Oncology, it was published in JCO, and Stephanie was my co-author on this. We did look at this, and the rates are even higher when you ask the individual behaviors that constitute the iceberg, even if you limit the time period to the past year or two. And so we have to do something about this. It is imperative for us to stand together against gender bias and harassment. It is a matter of professional ethics. There are both duty-based arguments. Human beings have a certain dignity that merits respect for its own sake, so it's just wrong for its own sake, and I wish I could say full stop, like mic drop and walk off the stage. but other people need to hear that it also has bad consequences. So there are teleological arguments that say that when half of the talent pool is women and half of the medical students are women and half of the trainees are women, we need women in senior positions to serve as role models. There, if you move from the educational mission to the research mission, there's abundant evidence that when you have people with different life experiences and backgrounds come together and they interact, they're more likely to solve problems, they have higher collective intelligence, and there's even teleological arguments that relate to clinical care delivery. And I'm going to call your attention to one led by my colleague Mylan Torres over here on hormone deprivation-free survival. Inequities persist in research priorities for patients with cancer. Okay, so we're all breast cancer people, and we're going to hear about the results of the Europa study on Thursday morning. And I want you to think when you go to that very important presentation about why it has been so hard for us in breast cancer to consider omission of endocrine therapy and consider the impact on quality of life that endocrine therapy has when it has been so readily accepted among our colleagues with prostate cancer. And this has been, there's so many examples about differences in mortality outcomes of hospitalists, and differences in collegiality and conflict in the OR based on the gender. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's real, it's there. And one of the things that I find most heartening is that it doesn't mean that women just have to seek care from women, or that there needs to be a perfect match of identity between provider and patient. That's not what it means. What it means is the workforce must be representative, because the PNAS study, which is the one that shows that if you're having a heart attack, because most of you in this audience look like you're women, if you're having a heart attack when you're a woman, if you get seen by a female provider, you're going to have the same outcome as a man, regardless of whether he was seen by a male or female provider. But if you're seen by a male provider, your mortality outcome is worse. That's kind of daunting. One of the good news parts of that study, and I think that actually the most important part of that study, is that the men who were providers, who were part of teams and groups with more female colleagues, had better outcomes in their female patients. So this is about diversifying the workforce as a whole. We have to learn from evidence. We have to gather data to improve our understanding, especially for those women who inhabit those intersections of multiple marginalized identities. Use that to inform our interventions and demonstrate the commitment of our institutions and our organizations to meaningful change. We have to facilitate reporting of harassment, but also recognize that when harassment has occurred, it's already too late, because it is very difficult to avoid the risk of being marginalized, victimized, stigmatized because you've come forward. And so what we need to do is prevent harassment in the first place. So certainly we should offer choices of complaint handlers, confidential and anonymous reporting systems, but what we really need to do is clarify our policies so we can prevent harassment from occurring in the first place, and that includes harassment by clients. So Anne mentioned, somebody who came in, whether they're an industry sales representative or whether they're a patient, they can bring in those biases. Being called by your first name by a patient can also have a tremendous detrimental impact on your well-being. It isn't just about insiders in the organization, but there are ways to address that. Believe it or not, even though our patients are vulnerable and they're experiencing the worst day of their lives often when they meet us, there are many ways to improve the expectations through things like patient rights and responsibilities documents. Ultimately, we need to stop thinking about this as a unidirectional mechanism by which unconscious bias, harassment, and the gender division of labor are simply conspiring to create gender inequity in those positions of influence and authority. But think about how the gender inequity at those levels allows those unacceptable behaviors to thrive in the first place. So we have to come together. And this is where, come on, you're my people. You have seen so many slides that show the many drivers of carcinogenesis. This isn't daunting to you. There's lots of drivers of carcinogenesis. There's lots of drivers of gender inequity. And what do we do as scientists? We say, hey, I'm going to pick that one molecule, and I'm going to do all my work on that one pathway, but I'm going to get rid of that one pathway. And if resistance develops through one of those other pathways, I got my colleague right over there, and she's working on that. And I got my colleague right over there, and she's working on that other factor. Look at the factors in the water that are allowing that iceberg to form. And no matter what level of seniority you have, think about one factor where you can be an ally, where you can be an advocate, where you can make a change locally, organizationally, nationally, over time, you'll gather more and more privilege and you'll have more and more opportunities to make change. But there are things that anyone can do. When you see someone being mistreated, you may not be in a position to be able to speak up, but you're absolutely in a position to try to help distract or end that, or to provide support afterwards. You know, it can take anyone saying, I've got a phone call right now that I'm sorry. I think they said they're the dean of something. I just need to ask you to come and take this phone call and break up the interaction between the target and the perpetrator. If you see something uncomfortable happening, you can do that, and you can say to the target afterwards, "I'm sorry, I must have dropped the call," and then afterwards explain to the target, "It just was making me feel really uncomfortable, and I hope that was okay." There are lots of things that people can do to intervene here. We need to be fixing the systems together. We need mentorship and sponsorship programs. This is not go out and find yourself a mentor or a sponsor. This is be a mentor, be a sponsor, and recognize that we together can create programs that will facilitate transformational change. We need evidence-based implicit bias training. Molly Carnes has developed some really effective work at the University of Wisconsin. Not all implicit bias training works. In fact, some of it backfires and people get actually worse. But there are forms that do work and help us think of unconscious bias as a bad habit that we need to break, and we need to constantly be working on breaking. And something that we all have. It's not like, the Karen Miller, Brian Miller thing. It's not like the women who were evaluating did a whole lot better than the men. We all have unconscious biases. Cultural transformation initiatives are important. I love that San Antonio has a filled room on this topic in the middle of a meeting. I think this is an incredibly important moment for cultural transformation within the field, and transparent and consistent criterion-based evaluation, promotion, and compensation processes. We need to focus on work-life integration because, as I mentioned, this is more of a challenge for women, and there's lots of creative initiatives that have been developed. The Claflin Awards program is one that was developed initially at the Massachusetts General Hospital, but has been broadened to a nationwide program by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and it provides helping hands in the workplace for individuals who have substantial family caregiving demands. It's the kind of thing that if you're in a room with a leader who says, yeah, but what can I really do? Do you have enough resources to give like a $50,000 a year grant to someone who's a real rock star of an early career faculty member who articulates a need for a little extra support because they're having some family caregiving demands? You could create that program. I just went and did a visiting professorship somewhere where someone said to me, well, what's something attainable that I could do? And they're like, I could actually do that. I could give 2 of those. I'm like, that could make a real difference for someone. On-site childcare is really important. Facilitating use of funds to support dependent care expenses. So for many years, NIH has permitted the use of federal funds to support bringing dependents to present work related to your grants. But most institutions have not had procedures in place that made it possible to use the funds for that allowable purpose. And then there's really cool stuff like time banking initiatives. So at Stanford, they thought up this program of giving people points for all the unrecognized service that they provided. Because we know that women, people of color, get turned to more and more often to be representatives of their people, to be good team players, and there's a lot of unrecognized service work that goes on. So let's try to reward that, and let's reward it with whatever people say they need. And so this time banking initiative actually allowed people to redeem credits for like being on a student's dissertation committee for anything you needed, whether it was food delivery service at home or grant writing service at work. We have to do something because if we don't change, that's the trajectory we're on. It will be, the current medical students will be retired, right? They're more than 50% female. The current medical students will be retired by the time we reach equity in those senior-most positions. And so we live at an important time. We saw just a couple of years ago that we were able to do things we thought we never could possibly have done, like clinical care delivery remotely, teaching over a Zoom screen? No, that's impossible. And yet we did that overnight. we are capable of transformational change. And some of the things we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic are things that we can continue to apply to help advance equity today. So we really have this wonderful opportunity to move from awareness to action, to embrace principles of dignity, safety, equity, fair equality of opportunity, equal pay for equal work, the things that we all care about, to support one another using that familiar healthcare quality improvement framework, right? That virtuous cycle of plan, do, study, act, reinforcing upon itself, innovating, evaluating, disseminating, coming together, empowering ourselves. So please remember, we have a tremendous opportunity this afternoon to learn from Anne Welsh how to be the best versions of ourselves, to be the most effective versions of ourselves, to advance the mission of addressing breast cancer and making sure that improving human health is a field that is accessible to all of the talented people who are going to follow us. Lots of people to acknowledge. Babies grow up very fast. Thank you for all that you have allowed me to take of your day, and I will turn it back over to Anne.
All right, well, thank you again, Dr. Jagsi. It is truly just an honor to share the stage with you. And I'm gonna ask if anyone's at a table by themselves or not very many people, consolidate, because I'm gonna make you talk to each other while they pull up my slide. So, as you just heard from Dr. Jagsi, there is a lot of work to do, and we're going to dig into that today. And Dr. Jagsi's research is so important and so meaningful to everyone in this room, to all of the physicians and the scientists. But what about me? I am not a physician nor a scientist, but I almost was. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. To hear my parents tell it, I was born with a stethoscope in hand. That's me with my dad in our very amazing clothing, timely. And I only remember wanting to be one of two things as a child. I wanted to be either the blue-haired guitarist from the TV show Jem and the Holograms, or I wanted to be a doctor. It seemed like doctor was maybe the more reasonable career choice. I liked science. I liked helping people, and I had two parents as doctors, so I had a lot of modeling and only a little bit of pressure, hence the Grey's Anatomy coloring book and birthday presents addressed to the future Dr. Kavanaugh. I did everything that I was supposed to do towards that goal. I took the classes that I was supposed to take. I got the grades I was supposed to get. I did summer camp at what I lovingly call nerd camp, where I studied ethnobotany and robotics and chemistry. And I got all the way to that medical school acceptance letter in my hand. And I remember standing in my kitchen with the big envelope, because back then it was all done by mail, right? You knew the big envelope had probably good news. And I saw the seal, the return stamp from Northwestern University, where both my parents had gone to school. And I opened it and I read the words, "Congratulations," and I felt numb. I wasn't excited. I wasn't relieved. And as I watched all of my family members and friends react with the excitement that I thought I should feel, I started to realize I had two choices. I could either just put one foot in front of the other along the path that felt kind of predestined for me, or I could get quiet and I could ask myself if this was actually what I wanted anymore. And spoiler alert, I said, no, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. But I actually don't want this. I want something else. And that was the first of multiple career pivots that I've made where I've had to undergo that same process, whether it was leaving my research-oriented career for one that was more practice-oriented, or leaving my work at Harvard to build my own firm. At each point, I've had to get quiet and to shut out all of the noise about what was expected of me, what I was told I should want, what I was allowed to do, and really tune into that question of what do I want and how am I going to get it? And it is that process that I want us to start undergoing today. So what do I have for you? Well, when I was first brainstorming this talk, I started with a lot of the typical stuff that you'll see in women's career development lectures. Things like own your achievements, network, speak up for yourself. These are all really important. It's not that it's bad advice, but when given in a vacuum, these tools don't work. Because the reality is there's no behavioral hack out of discrimination. There was a study done that came out last year, and they asked women in leadership across all sorts of fields to share the things for which they had been criticized. And there was a list of 30 things, and you won't be surprised to know that many of the things were in direct conflict with one another. Women were told they were too quiet, they were told they were too loud, they were told they were too aggressive, they were told they were not assertive enough. They were criticized for how they looked, how they spoke, how they dressed. And in the end, the summary point that they came to was that the women were just never quite right, because in the end, the criticisms were thinly veiled gender bias. They were criticized simply for being women. And I say this not because it's hopeless, but because it's helpful to know what you're up against. The reality is that we are playing a rigged game, and that is really important context to hold as we move forward today. It's why it sometimes feels so hard. So what do I have for you instead? Well, I'm going to frame my talk around the 3 most common concerns that I hear from women in my office. We're going to talk about the coping tools and the related leadership skills for those. And I'm going to give you things to take home with you so that you can further your growth and development outside of this room. And then we'll wrap up by introducing the Navigating Success Leadership Community, a program we piloted last year with great success, and that we will invite any of you to participate in again in 2025. So I work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My clients are at MIT, they're at Harvard, they're at the Whitehead Institute, at the Broad. They are working in thriving startups, they're at big behemoth pharma companies, and you'd think that if anywhere in the world might be filled with confident women scientists, it might be Cambridge, Massachusetts. And yet, on some level, many of them are all struggling with the same things. When it comes to growing their career, they ask themselves, am I enough? They say, I don't even know what I want anymore. And they're exhausted. They are burnt out, they are tired, they are lonely, they are anxious. So if you are in this room feeling any of these things, I want you to know you are not alone. Know that you are in some amazing company. And even if you're not feeling any of these things, I hope that you will still find actionable steps to use today to further hone your own desires and your wants, and then to pair those desires with action. But before we get started with anything more, I want to pause, and I want to make sure we don't gloss over perhaps the most important thing I've said today, and that is this: you are not alone. One of the things that I have found to be true over and over again in my career is that there is power in community. Women are so often told that they are too much, that they are crazy, and that they specifically, individually, are the problem. And yet, when I get women together in rooms like these, I find that those sentiments come crumbling down because we see that this is, in fact, a shared experience. So today, I want our experience here to be more than just me talking and you listening and learning individually. I want us to start building connection and community in these moments. To start, I want you to just take a few minutes here and introduce yourself to the table around you. Share your name, maybe what you do, what brought you here, what you're hoping to get out of it, a hobby. Just take 2 or 3 minutes to get to know the other women that are here with you. I feel like I could just let this be the entire talk and it would still be amazing. I love hearing all the connection and the talking. This just is like amazing to me. But if I let that happen, I won't get through the rest of my slides, and where will we be? So let's start with that first question. Am I enough? This comes in so many different forms, and my guess is that everybody has felt at least one of these things, right? This is covering perfectionism, people-pleasing, imposter syndrome, anxiety. All of these, though, stem from the fundamental idea that I am the problem and that I am overwhelmed because I personally am uniquely incapable. Many of us try to solve this problem by achieving our way out of it, right? As a kid, certainly for me, this showed up as if I could get the A, maybe for a moment, check, I was enough. And as an adult, I'm not getting A's anymore, but I love a good to-do list. And if I can just check off everything on that for maybe a moment, I can feel like enough. The problem is this doesn't actually work, right? Because especially for those of us with really challenging big careers and with any sort of adult responsibility outside of that, the to-do list is never done. The only reward for finishing your to-do list is another to-do list, right? That feeling of not enoughness, that overwhelming sense of maybe I'm not a good enough doctor, maybe I'm not a good enough mother, daughter, friend, partner, community member, can't be solved with an A. Because part of life is inherently struggling and failing. You are all doing something remarkably hard in your career. And that is going to come with inevitable bumps in the road, with inevitable mistakes. That's actually how we grow, right? So we have to learn to not only tolerate our imperfections, but celebrate them as part of our growth journey. I can stand up here and say this, right? And that's one thing. And you may all theoretically agree with me, but I also know that it's a really different ballgame to move it from a cognitive belief to an actual belief. And so to help facilitate that, I want to give you a little bit of a primer on CBT, or cognitive behavioral theory. So CBT is the premise, or is the idea that our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions are all related. And within that, our brains really hate dissonance. They don't like it when these things are mismatched, and they will actually pull them into alignment. We can use that to our advantage by intentionally moving one corner of the triangle to kind of pull everything with it. That's actually the whole theory behind cognitive behavioral therapy, is that we're changing our thoughts, right? And we can use this here today for ourselves as well, and we can actually touch on every single point of the triangle to help make some movement and build confidence. So the first quarter that I want to talk about, or corner, is the thoughts. The first thing you need to know with that is that thoughts are thoughts. They are not facts, right? And everyone can say, yeah, of course I know my thoughts are not facts, but how many times do you think something and just automatically believe it? Ugh, I'm such a bad mom. I yelled at my kids. Must be true, right? Or, ugh, I made this mistake with a patient. I'm a horrible doctor. Must be true. Right? We believe our thoughts, and yet we don't have to. They are just thoughts. And not only that, we can intentionally cultivate a different set of thoughts that will help build our confidence out of the same experiences. So for this, I like to use the example of skiing. I grew up in the Midwest, very flat part of the country. If you wanted to go skiing, you could kind of on like a garbage dump they covered in snow, and it was usually negative 20 degrees, and it was not at all a pleasant experience, so I never really took to it. But my husband is from New England, I now live in New England, and my kids were all gonna learn to ski, and I wanted to learn to ski with them. Let me tell you what a humbling experience is. It is being the 40-year-old that gets off at the top of the ski lift and promptly falls down, while all of the 3-year-olds seamlessly ski around you, navigating it safely to the bottom of the hill. My automatic thoughts at these moments were things like, this is so embarrassing. I look like an idiot. Everybody else is looking at me and thinking, what is she doing? Ow, this is painful. I should just give up. This is never going to work. But I had the goal of learning this skill and at least being able to safely navigate to the bottom of the mountain, so I cultivated a different set of intentional thoughts. I reminded myself, mistakes mean you're learning. This is how you're going to figure it out. You have to keep trying. You can do this. I reminded myself of the goal of being able to ski with my kids. And I reminded myself that learning takes practice. The only way you're going to learn something is to try it and to fail until you actually get it right. And when I reminded myself of all of those things, I was able to build a little more confidence, a little more resiliency. And I will say at this point, I can safely get down to the bottom of the green hill, although if I want to ski with my kids, I have to ask them to slow down a lot. Right? So that's corner one. The next corner that we can address is our feelings. Now, I want to put an asterisk here. As a psychologist, I am never going to tell anybody that their feelings are invalid or that you have to change them. That's not what I'm getting at here. What I'm getting at here is the idea that we can actually be feeling multiple things at the same time, and being aware of the nuance and the variety in our feelings in a moment can be the thing that builds courage. So, in order to understand this, I want to talk about how we experience emotions briefly. There are two theories, or two ways in which emotions develop, and the first is top-down, and this is what we typically think about with feeling development. We have an event or an experience, and then we have a feeling, and then that shows up in our body in certain ways. So I get up on this stage, and I think, oh my God, what if I forget everything I'm supposed to say? And my heart starts racing a little bit, and my breath gets shallow, my hands get shaky, and I am feeling anxiety, right? However, there's another way in which our feelings develop, and that is bottom up. And in bottom up feeling development, we actually have the physiological response first, and then we label it based on context. And that context can be the event. That context can be cultural rules around what feelings are considered acceptable or not, and the context can even be our language, right? What words do we have for feelings? And that's how we label them. So I could have this exact same experience, right? I could get on stage, my breath gets a little shallow, my heart starts racing, my hands tremble, and I say, oh, that's anxiety. But let me change the context. Take those same three physiological experiences. So I said shaking hands, racing heart, and shallow breath. And now the context is my 8-year-old on Christmas morning. What's she feeling? Excitement, right? It's the same set of physiological responses, but when we shift the meaning behind it, we shift the feeling. And anxiety and excitement in particular are kind of right next to each other in the brain and right next to each other in terms of those physiological feelings. It is possible to feel both things. I can be on the stage and feel anxious, right? Because what if I forget everything? But I can also feel excited because what an amazing opportunity this is, right? I get to talk to all of you about this stuff that I'm really passionate about and share important information with everyone. It can be really, really helpful to realize that we might feel two things. So to remember this, I like to use the example of roller coasters. I have a 15-year-old kid, and he is anxious. He's got a lot of anxiety, but he's a huge roller coaster fanatic. Like, the bigger the drop, the more upside down, the better. I usually am terrified just watching him and can watch through covered eyes, but he loves it. And I said to him at some point, kiddo, don't you get scared? Don't you feel anxious? I'm anxious just watching the thing go, and I'm not even on it. And he said, of course. But I also feel excited. So the next time you have to do something scary in your career, or you don't feel ready, or you don't feel capable, think about a roller coaster and ask yourself, is there any excitement here that I can tap into? The last corner is the behaviors corner. Oftentimes people talk about this as fake it till you make it, but I like to think of it more as practice, just like you would practice an instrument. We believe what we do, and sometimes we have to practice new behaviors as a way to change our beliefs. And that's what I want us to get at today, because sometimes we are inadvertently using behaviors that are actually teaching ourselves the wrong thing. So, just to introduce this idea, I want to ask all of you, how many of you regularly undermine your achievements? I used to do this all the time. And if I'm honest with you, I still do it occasionally. I'll succeed, and then I'll immediately take it away from myself somehow. I'll say, oh, that wasn't that hard. It wasn't a big deal. a lot of other people have done that too. Or I'll just jump to the next thing that is on my to-do list. I'll be like, okay, that's over, great, check, now I need to get to this next thing. Or I will dismiss compliments in the same way, right? I used to do this all the time. I was a musician, and I'd play a recital, and people would come up to me afterwards and say, oh, that was lovely, and I'd say, well, let me tell you about the 300 mistakes I made that you didn't notice. The problem with this is that it sends our brain, oops, sorry about that. It sends our brain a signal that we don't matter. What is going on with, sorry about this. There we go. When we undermine our achievements, it tells our brains that they are in fact not important, and we start to believe them, right? We actually erode our confidence with each and every mistake that we focus on. We erode our confidence with each and every success that we dismiss. And eventually, it starts to send us the message that we aren't important, that our successes don't matter, and in fact, no, you are not enough. So I want us to start challenging that today, and in this room. I want you to, if you have paper and pen, get it out. I'm gonna have you writing a couple things down today, or if you don't have paper and pen, you wanna do it like on a note in your phone, that's fine too. I don't mind if you have your technology out. But I want you to just we're gonna do 2 minutes, and I know this might feel uncomfortable for some of you. It certainly would for me at various points in my life. I want you to write down your wins over the past month or two. And yes, certainly include the big ones. If you saved a patient's life, if you got a grant, if you got a paper accepted, put those down. But also the little ones. If you had a hard conversation with someone, if you wrote an email you really didn't want to have to write, and every single one of you can put being here in this room as a win, right? Because we are not told that it's okay to take an afternoon to focus on ourselves and our careers as women. We are told to focus on our patients, to focus on our work, focus on our families, to focus on whatever else that other people need, but never ourselves. So showing up is a win. Again, I'm just gonna give you 2 minutes to come up with as many things as you can in the past couple months. And now I want you to just pause where you are. I know you may have hopefully many, many more wins that you could possibly write in 2 minutes, but I just want us to get started with the idea of practicing this. I'm actually going to ask you to look at your table mates and share one of the wins with your group. And I'm going to have you do this for 2 reasons. One is multimodal learning theory. So we learn information much better when we work with it in multiple ways. So you've written it, now I'm going to have you speak it. It's just a better way to get it into your brain. But the other reason, and perhaps the more important reason, is that part of today's mission is to build community. And what better way to do that than to sit together for a minute and share some wins and successes and have it celebrated. So again, just pick one. I'm going to give you a couple minutes and share it with your table. Every time I have to call you back from these breakout sessions, I cringe because I love hearing the connection, and I promise there'll be lots more to come. But I also want to make sure we have time to get to everything. And so now I'm going to give you a little homework assignment based on this exercise, and that is this. I want you to make this a regular practice, right? I want this to become something you do on a regular basis. So your homework is to pick a cadence that works for you. It could be every day, it could be once a week, it could be once a month, but take time to notice and sit with your wins. It really does make a difference. And extra credit, if anyone like me was like me, an extra credit chaser, share it with someone. Find an accountability buddy. Maybe it's a partner or a friend or a colleague. Maybe it's someone, maybe even better, it's someone at this table that you had literally never met, and you exchange emails, and the email is like monthly wins thread, right? And you send it to each other back and forth. It matters. Send your brain the signal that you are enough. Take that in. Because the more we celebrate our wins, the more we build our confidence to go after what it is we want, to take the scary steps to grow our careers towards whatever that future may be. But what is that? So many of us struggle to answer this question. Heck, there are times where I can't even tell you what I want for dinner, let alone what I want for my career. The problem is that we are socialized from the minute we are born as women to turn this off. We are told, be small, be quiet, be good girls, don't take up space, be martyrs, be people pleasers. And I think on top of that, many of us went into our careers in this room, at least, out of a feeling of calling and a mission. And in STEM and healthcare, we have this desire to make a difference. And that can be kind of a double problem because we feel like we should prioritize that over everything else. But the problem is when we let our wants and our needs take a back seat, we are just cruising towards burnout, right? Anxiety, depression, all of these negative mental health outcomes. Knowing what you want and being able to articulate that is actually key to so much of what we're talking about today. Because that's the thing that lets you fuel up. It's the thing that gives you permission to take breaks. It is the thing that gives you alignment and feels really fulfilling. And so I want us, once again, to do some practicing of naming our wants here so that you can start to tune into what it is. So once again, I'm gonna have you, again, if you've got your notebooks, your paper, or your phone, or whatever you're doing, and I want you to just start by listing, I'll say 3 to 5 things that you want personally or professionally. And I want you to notice nobody is carving this in like a stone tablet, right? This is on a piece of paper. You don't have to get it right. There's no right or wrong. This doesn't have to be the thing you pursue. Just the idea of naming what you want. And as you're thinking about your things, they can be things you want to have. So I want to have a lake house. I want to have this new piece of equipment for my lab. It could be things you want to be. I want to be an artist. I want to be an attending. Or it could be things you want to do, right? I want to run a marathon, or maybe I want to open my own clinic. So again, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes here to brainstorm a list of things that maybe you could want. So you can keep working on this list as if you're not done, as I give you kind of the next piece of the assignment. But I want you to not just name your wants today, right? I want us to pair desire and action, and I want you to, basically in the next 10 minutes of this exercise, be able to have some action steps you can take the minute you leave this room if you should choose to do so. I want ideas that come with momentum and changes that stick. So now pick one want, and you can do this for the rest of them, when you get home or with some extra time. And I want you to come up with 3 action steps, and they need to be simple, they need to be clear and well-defined, and they need to be doable in 5 minutes. Now, before you stare at me like I have 3 heads, 5 minutes is important here for a couple reasons, right? I understand that if your goal is to run a marathon, it may feel like it's crazy to come up with anything towards that end that I can do in 5 minutes. But a marathon is just a series of steps, right? It literally is putting one foot in front of the other. And things that we can do in 5 minutes build momentum. They help get us started and get us over the hurdle of that initiation or activation energy. And they send our brain the message that, yes, you can do this and you can have this. So let me just give you a couple examples before I send you off to do this on your own. Let's say your goal was to run a marathon. If that were my goal, I'd have a really long road in front of me, no pun intended, because I don't run. But my 5-minute goals might be digging my running shoes out of the attic. It's been that long since I've run. I could sign up for like a Couch to 5K program, something that would get me started. And I could text an accountability buddy to have someone to check in with, right? Each of those goals takes 5 minutes, and yet they are things that will get me started towards the larger goal. Another example I can give you is that that's a little more career-oriented. I'm working on a book, and about a month ago, I got really exciting news that I have an agent, and then life got lifey, as it so often does, and things came up, and I haven't touched it in a month, and I really need to get back to it. So again, a book is a really large goal. How much can I write in 5 minutes? Probably that much, not much. But I can still come up with goals that matter and goals that get me started. I could literally say, I'm gonna write for 5 minutes and just have that process happen. I could use the 5 minutes to block some time in my calendar so that I could get back to it. And I have to interview people for the book, so I could at least write the emails to schedule those, right? And each of those steps, although small, are things that are gonna build momentum towards me actually achieving the bigger picture goal. So I want you to pick one of the goals that you listed and just come up with 3 action steps, if you can, that are 5-minute action steps. And then we'll do one more things with these as a table group. I know what I'm asking you to do is hard, and I know that it is an important practice. I also know that we are much more likely to achieve any goals that we have when we share them out loud. So once again, I'm going to ask you to use your table mates, and I'd like you to just quickly share your goal and your step. And if you're feeling extra brave, I'd love for you to share when you're going to take it. So again, just give you 2 minutes, but share your goal and a step, and ideally when you're going to take it. Maybe it's even today. I hope that all of you have been able to think about something that you can do, like I said, maybe even when you leave this room today, because you get to go after your wants. Sometimes your wants can feel big or scary, or they can feel far away, and it can be so easy to put them on the back burner. And yet, it is important. There is magic in those first steps towards a goal, because those steps tell you that you get to move forward, that you get to have what you want. That's where the magic is. We want to tell our brains that we're making progress and that we are worth it, and start a positive feedback loop. That also allows us to pursue our wants in a more sustainable way, and that's the last piece that I want us to get to today. So often we can feel exhausted and burnt out, and as I said, that is perhaps the #1 concern that people come into my office with. And if you are feeling that way, you are not alone. You are not failing. The system is failing you. You are not broken. You have a broken mirror. And it is not hard because you're doing it wrong. It's hard simply because it's hard. I will use analogies like this over and over and over again because this is such an important message for you to take in. You are not struggling or wrong because of your own inadequacy. I have this client who I've been working with for a long time, and I adore her, and she is a brilliant scientist, and she's had a pretty meteoric rise in her career. And when she came to me, her tendency was to kind of run, and then collapse. Rest intentionally was not part of her lexicon. And we started to use the analogy of mountain climbing for her and her career. And I kind of likened her tendency to someone who was trying to sprint up a mountain, right? So she'd sprint until she literally couldn't move anymore, and she'd collapse on the ground in a heap in the middle of the trail until she had enough energy to at least get up, and then she'd sprint again and collapse. It kind of worked in the beginning, especially if, those of you who've done grad school, you remember you get kind of some breaks around holidays that people hand to you, but it really is not sustainable. And we started talking about the importance of intentional rest. And I said, so you can, instead of waiting till you collapse, you can actually carve out a little moment, right? You can sit down on a rock, you can get out a granola bar and your water bottle and rest. And when you do that, you get to pick where you stop. So maybe you take in the view, right? Maybe you pick a lovely vista rather than just collapsing in the middle of the trail, and you enjoy the process. And on top of that, it's actually more sustainable over the long term. You're gonna be able to climb higher up this mountain if you actually stop to rest. And she started to get it, right? And she started to really carve out intentional rest and refueling time, and was feeling confident and was continuing to see her career grow. But one day she came in and she said, Anne, there's this guy, this colleague, and he never seems to have the need to rest. And I stuck with the mountain climbing analogy, and I said to her, let's call this guy Science Bro. Science Bro, it sounds like, has come just running up the mountain behind you, never rests, and is gonna make it to the top in record time. And she said, yeah, so is the problem that I'm just really out of shape? No. The problem is not at all that you are out of shape. The problem is that you, and really everyone in this room, is carrying a 100-pound backpack. See, on her mountain climb, she's got all of the food that she needs for the journey. She's got her water stacked up. She's got a first aid kit in case she gets hurt or really anyone else. She's got like a pickaxe for the ice at the top. Oh, and she's picking up everybody else's trash along the way and putting it in her backpack to clean up the trail. And so her backpack's actually getting heavier and heavier as she climbs. Science Bro does not have a backpack. He's got like a selfie stick and a phone, and no wonder he sprints to the top. There are people handing him water as he goes, handing him snacks, and he's just throwing the trash on the trail as he runs up. You are not out of shape. You just have a 100-pound backpack. We have to allow it to be harder for us and to have the struggle not reflect our capability, because that is when we then allow ourselves permission to take care of ourselves and to exercise self-compassion. I'm not going to read this out loud, but you can read it on the slide. This was a letter to the editor that went out. This was probably a year old at this point, but it was a male engineering student who articulated this very point by noticing that his female colleagues who were at the same point in their careers had earned it with so much more work than he had had to put in. We have to find ways to grow in our careers that are sustainable and that reflect the world in which we are currently living, in which we are allowed to take space and take rest. So often we are told just to get through, right? And I think that mindset is really cultivated in medical school training, where you're told, just get through to the next thing, right? It'll be better. Just get through medical school. It'll be fine on the other side. Oh, no. Just get through this intern thing. Then it'll be easier. And just get through residency. You'll be fine once you're in attending. The reality, it doesn't actually get any easier, and life probably gets more and more complicated. We can't spend our entire lives waiting for it to get easier. You cannot sprint up the mountain. So what do we do? Well, I want to briefly start by going over the 8 research-backed categories of tools to prevent and beat burnout, but we're going to go a lot deeper than this today. But just as a brief introduction, this is not an exhaustive list, and this is not a list of a checklist that you have to do all of these things. These are just general categories. The first is connection, community, right? What we're building today. This can be with colleagues, it can be with family members, friends. It can also just be connecting with like the barista who gives you your coffee every morning. The next category is affection. This can be hugs. Hugs are miracle tools, but it can also be, snuggling with your pet. We have a bearded dragon in my house. He'll sit on your shoulder, and it can be very soothing to stroke him, right? It can even be giving yourself a hug. I know that sounds silly, but actually it works. Boundaries, right, are a huge important part of self-care. Being able to say no to things when you don't want to do them, or say yes to things that are simply for you. Feeling your feelings. I understand that there are times and places where perhaps we cannot express our feelings to their full effect given the situation or in professional settings, but making sure to carve out time outside of that to feel your feelings is really important. Play. Playfulness is incredibly important, and that can be playing a board game, but it can also be any sort of creative pursuit. Breathing. Sounds basic, yes, but intentional breath work is a remarkable tool, as is movement. Exercise, sure, but any sort of movement that feels good in your body, or it can be body work or progressive muscle relaxations, right? It doesn't have to be intense. And then, of course, rest, right? Sleep, making sure you have time to stare into space or do nothing, even for brief moments. But I want to go beyond this list today, because classically, burnout talks kind of end here. They say, here's your list of things, go do them, and you will be fine. But that actually leaves two problems. Number one is a lot of talk about burnout doesn't address the systemic issues, right? And Dr. Jagsi did such a brilliant job of sharing the lay of the land with us today. This is not a you problem, right? There are systemic issues that are contributing to this, and we have to be aware of that when we think about what our road out of burnout is going to look like. The other part of the problem is that this is not a one-size-fits-all experience or list. What works for me is not going to be the thing that works for you, and there may even be things that work for me that are counterproductive for you. So just like you all find the exact right type of treatment for a patient's specific type of cancer, I want us to start the process today of finding the exact right roadmap for you to avoid or come out of burnout. One that fits your sensation and perception systems, one that fits your nervous system. And to do that, I do want to talk briefly about the nervous system from an emotional lens. So I'm not going to talk up here about myelin sheaths and dendrites, although I love a good neuroanatomy lesson. I'm going to talk about regulation and self-understanding, and briefly about the vagus nerve. So I think this nerve is so cool. There is so much interesting research happening around health and mental health and depression, the role of the vagus nerve in treating depression, in GI functioning and immune functioning. And it's the reason for all of the really kind of vast types of research is because this is such a large nerve and it touches every organ in our body, but it is also responsible for our stress response, right? This nerve is the reason that when you feel stressed, sometimes you start to wear your shoulders like earrings, or you feel like your stomach hurts, or you get some heartburn, right? The vagus nerve's main job is to keep us safe and alive. And in doing that, it has two states, regulation and dysregulation. In regulation, we feel at ease. We can think creatively, we feel connected to those around us, we have the capacity to be intentional and kind of take pauses, and we have some clarity. Basically, regulation is where we always would love to be if we had the choice. Dysregulation can look a lot of different ways, and we'll get into some more nuance with this in a minute, but essentially it's the opposite. In dysregulation, it's hard to get clarity. If you've ever had that experience of like, I can't think, you're probably in a state of dysregulation on some level. It's your brain saying something's not safe. Either danger is here, or at least danger is imminent, and you have to be on guard, and you maybe don't have time to think or to be creative or to get intentional about things. You have to get ready to react. When we are in that dysregulated space, there are three things that help. The first one is context, understanding why you feel the way you do, understanding what is going on. This is why I keep saying we have to understand that it is hard because it is hard. This is why Dr. Jagsi's work is so important. The second thing that helps is connection, right? I've talked about that a lot today, and there's a reason for that. Humans are a social species, and even the most introverted souls among us, and I'll put myself in that category, we need people. We need connection. When we have a feeling that is validated or shared with another person, it helps us feel safer with that feeling. It helps us tolerate that feeling. And then the last piece is choice, and the knowledge that you can do something different. And that's what I want to do with this last part of our workshop, is give you an understanding of how your body looks in these different states and what tools you can use to regulate and move yourself out of them. So we're going to make a little map, and your map is not going to have to look exactly like this, but essentially we're going to look at these 3 different brain states and you're going to get a sense of what does my body look like in these states, what do my feelings, my thoughts look like in these states, and then what are the resources that we can tap into to get ourselves out of it. So really briefly, the safe state that we talked about is called the ventral state. That's the top one on the ladder here. And this is where we feel connected to the world. Again, we feel safe. Then we're going to break down that dysregulation into 2 different states. And the first is sympathetic. This is the one in which danger is imminent, but perhaps not here yet. It's where we're getting ready to run, getting ready to fight. It is a feeling of intensity, but action. And then the last or bottom state on the ladder is the dorsal state. And in this, it is a feeling of I have shut down, I cannot do anything. This is where kind of classic burnout lives. And before we go into getting the details and making your maps, I want to emphasize that none of these states are bad or shameful. I think in particularly, if any of you are like type A achievers like me, right, I don't like getting in that bottom state of feeling like I can't do anything. I'm much better when I'm in a sympathetic state of, oh, I have to do everything. But yet, there's value in all of these. What we don't want is to get stuck in them, right? We developed them evolutionarily for a reason, but we want to be able to pull ourselves out of them and move back up the ladder. So let's start at the bottom. And I'm going to start at the bottom so that we get to end our afternoon at the top and connecting with safety. This one is called the dorsal state. And the predominant feeling when you're in a dorsal state is I can't. I cannot do another thing. That is apathy, disconnection, exhaustion, kind of feeling like literally I can't move, figuratively I can't move, I can't think. And it usually comes with a lot of thoughts about this is hard, what's the point? I don't want to do this anymore, I can't, it's impossible. Right? And that may look a lot of different ways. Often it's withdrawing from people or withdrawing from things, hiding under the covers. So this is a general description of it, but I want you to come up with a list that is your version of it. So I want you to think of a dorsal event. And I don't want you to think of something really, really intense. Maybe think of something that's kind of dorsal light. So for me, that might be, I've had maybe a very long day of treating patients, and there was a lot of intensity, and I get to, home, and it's 6 o'clock, and I just can't for a minute, right? Like I just am at a state where I can't have conversations, I can't really think, and I'm fried. And I want you to just visualize that event outside of yourself. Like maybe visualize it on the stage, not putting yourself in it. And watch the event and notice, and you can write this down on your paper, what's the event? What are the triggers? And what are the thoughts and feelings and behaviors that you experience in this event? Because again, this is going to look unique to you. So you can use things on this list as ways to brainstorm, but write down some of the stuff that shows up for you when you're in this space. And now I want you to also add to your list, what are your regulating resources? And by that, what I mean is, what are the things that help you come out of that state? And again, I can't say it enough, this is going to be really individual, right? What gets you from that step on the ladder up a step? Think back to that original list, right? Is there a piece of connection, of playfulness, of movement, rest? For me, when I'm in a dorsal state, I know that I need like a sensory deprivation chamber, essentially, right? I don't want to hear, I don't want music, I don't want to talk to anybody. I need to have no sensory input for a little while, and maybe some light movement, right? Other people, that might feel horrible, right? Other people may say, I really need to talk to people. Otherwise, I start to feel really isolated and alone, and that's horrible. Or I really do need that movement. Or this is where I need, physical affection and a hug to feel better. Maybe it's a sensory experience, touching something cold, or maybe it's a hot bath. So again, be brainstorming. Think about that event you just listed, and what are the regulating resources that pull you out of it? All right, so now we're going to do the same thing with one step up the ladder and the sympathetic state. Now, this is one that, again, I'm super familiar with. This is a place of I must. I must do everything myself. I must do it all right now. It must be perfect. Does this sound familiar to anybody else in this room? Maybe? Just me? Right? So this is where we're worried, we're frustrated, we're fearful, we're angry. We might feel like we're veering out of control. It's all of those classic physiological symptoms of anxiety, kind of a tightness in your chest, can't sit still. The thoughts are, again, that I must, I have to move forward, I have to fix this, I have to do so immediately. And again, it all makes sense. If you think about this is the state of danger is imminent. I have to rally my resources to protect myself. This can be an incredibly productive place. I will tell you that, right? These different states aren't bad. We just can't live in them. Right? And the behaviors are going to look different for different people, but again, a classic version of I can't rest, I cannot sit down, I cannot take a break. That's often what shows up. So just like we did with the last one, I want you to go through the process of thinking of a sympathetic experience and watch it play out, kind of visualize it playing out on a wall in front of you. Don't kind of take it in too much. And you can write down on your paper what was the event, what kinds of things in general trigger this for you, and what are your thoughts and feelings and behaviors in this space. And then once again, I'm just going to ask you one final question here. I would like you to think about what are my regulating resources and my coping tools in this sympathetic state. And most likely there are going to be a very different list than what was in the dorsal state, right? Again, are there places of connection, of rest, of movement, of play, of feeling that work for you here? And for me, in the sympathetic state, I need to burn off some energy, like hopping on the Peloton or getting outside for a really vigorous walk. Those are great options. Hugs are wonderful for me here, and talking to people, if I can kind of connect with someone else. However, I know people where talking about it in this state just makes them spin up more, and it's actually not helpful at all. So think about, for you, given the situation, the example you just gave, what got you out of it? What tools did you access? What was the path forward? And jot those down. And now for the more fun one, we're going to talk about the ventral state. And so this is safety. This is where you feel connected, right? This is flow, energetic, open-hearted, curious. There's a feeling of space, of enough time, and of presence, right? That's kind of the presence and the intention are really, really fundamental here. So we're going to do a slightly different version, but it's going to start off feeling very similar. I want you to think of a ventral event. Now this time it could be really big, right? It could be the biggest, most ventral event of your entire life. Maybe it was the day you graduated medical school and you felt amazing, getting that hood, or the day you had a kid. But it can also be a really small ventral event. Whatever you want to work with for today is fine. For me, I access a ventral event on a really regular basis when I carve out time to have like a cup of hot tea and not do anything else, right? And so for 5 minutes, and I'm focusing on the warmth of that cup and not scrolling my phone and not doing anything else but just enjoying that moment, that's a ventral experience. Or for you, it could be at work, right? Sometimes we get into a flow state when you're doing research. I hope many of you had that experience of, I'm just so immersed in this question and so connected and interested that kind of time goes by, right? That's a ventral state too. So think of a ventral state, and this time you don't have to imagine it on the wall, right? You can fully embody it and feel all of those amazing feelings again. And think about, once again, what was the event, like what got you there, and then what are the thoughts and feelings and behaviors for you that show up in ventral? And I'd love to just let you sit in that for the remainder of the talk, but I have a few more minutes of your time and things I want to get through. So the last piece here, we talked about what are your regulating resources, how do you get out of these other states. But with ventral, I want to ask you to think about what are your glimmers. Now this sounds like a silly word. It became very kind of pop culture, pop psychology popular a couple years ago, and it's essentially a play on the word trigger, right? So often when we talk about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about the triggers, the things in our current life that trigger past negative experiences. But we can also have glimmers, things that trigger us, essentially, to think about positive past experiences and can put us into ventral states, right? And so I want you to list here, what are the things that get me into ventral, right? It can be the small things like my cup of hot tea or reading a really good book or work, but just come up with a list of the things that you enjoy. And you can even think about it as, what are the breadcrumbs of joy for me, right? What are the little bitty pieces that get me into a good or happy or flow or energetic state? And you can even think back to what used to do that, right? What did that for me as a kid? Are there things I want to kind of play with now as an adult? So just, again, take one more minute here and write some of those down. So once again, I have a homework assignment for you. I should have been a teacher. I have given you a really rough map today, right? We have kind of given you, this is like the scratching the surface version. You've got some street names and like maybe a house or two, but I want you to keep working with this. I want you to make this an incredibly detailed map, right? Add the houses and the trees and the people and the colors, because this is a map that can show you where you are and how to get out. This is the map that will give you that choice we were talking about, right? We live in a world where so often as women we are told we are crazy. And it is empowering to understand where you are, why you're there, and how to help yourself. So often we are told to get through or to just dig deep. And really what we need in our life is to 10x those glimmers, right? And so bonus points, extra credit, seek out those glimmers. And actually the reality is if you take nothing away from this lecture except that, let it be that. Follow the breadcrumbs of joy. Get more glimmers. You are worth it. And when you do that, you send your brain the signal that you matter, that your needs and your wants are important and you're allowed to chase them. Practice these glimmers on offense, right? Because the more we do them, the more accessible they become even in the hard moments. But what happens Monday morning? I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but sometimes you go to a workshop, you go to a symposium or whatever, you get excited, there are new ideas, and you get back to your real life. And then Monday morning comes and your children are crying and your boss is asking you for something and patients are complaining, and it's really quick and easy slide back into the land of overwhelm. And I do not want that to be the experience for any of you here today. So I've given you lots of homework. If you forgot it, email me. I will, on my next slide, you have my email. I will send you the homework details again. I will not grade it, but I'll at least send you the assignments, right? Practice the skills we talked about today. You can't just do them once and have it make a big difference, but you can do them over time and have it add up to a big difference, for sure. However, we also have an opportunity that we want to introduce to you as a way to get more support and more accountability in making these changes. And it is the Navigating Success Women's Leadership Community. And we piloted this program last year thanks to the generous sponsorship of Gilead. It was a group of 40 women who received monthly coaching with me. We had a monthly group call as well as regular webinars and information presented on various topics like we touched on today: burnout, networking, time management, boundary setting, goal setting. And every month I was just amazed at the connections and the community that we formed over the course of the year. So we get to offer this program one more time for 2025, again sponsored by Gilead. If you are even remotely interested in participating, just scan the QR code here, or there's a paper at least at some of the tables with it, or on the signs at the back of the room as you leave. It's just going to ask you for your name and your email and some scheduling questions, so it's like not a big commitment to sign up. That way I'll have your name and can get you the information once we get the program started. It's not a commitment to participate. However, I really do encourage anybody that wants to raise their hand, because it was really a wonderful experience for the women in the group and for me. If you have questions about the program, I will stick around after and I'm happy to answer them, but I don't want to keep everybody here and try to be mindful of everybody's time. So I want to thank all of you, right? I want to thank all of you for participating for today, for coming here. I know there were other things competing for your attention, and I am so honored that you chose to come and spend some of your afternoon with me here. I also want to thank Dr. Jagsi again. It is just such a privilege to share the stage with you, and I am just in awe of your work. I feel really, really lucky to be up here. I hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and please do reach out if you have questions or if you want to talk about any of the things that I shared with you today. I love to connect with people. And yeah, thank you, and happy holidays and happy 2025.